In the middle of the 16th century, a shipdock in Seville waiting for the arrival of the Flota de Indias, the treasure fleet from the Americas, was the center of the financial universe. When those sails appeared on the horizon, a collective sigh of relief would wash over the entire continent of Europe. These ships were not just carrying cargo, they were carrying the economic lifeblood of the Western world. They were laden down to the gunwales with bars of silver stacked like firewood, chests overflowing with gold coins, pearls from the Caribbean, and emeralds from the Andes. The quantities were staggering. In just one good year, Spain might import enough precious metal to double the existing money supply of the rest of Europe combined. The King of Spain, sitting in his austere palace of El Escorial outside Madrid, was arguably the richest man who had ever walked the earth since the days of the Roman Caesars. His empire stretched from the Philippines to Flanders, from Naples to Mexico City. He owned the legendary mountain of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia, a geological freak of nature that was practically made of solid silver. The Spanish Habsburgs did not just have money, they had the source of money. They had a license to print the global reserve currency of the era. And yet, this is not a success story. It is perhaps the greatest financial morality tale in human history. Because that same king, sitting atop that mountain of gold, was broke, not just short of cash, but catastrophically, ruinously deeply in debt. The paradox is so extreme it seems fictional. The empire that owned almost all the money in the world could not pay its bills. Between the mid-16th and late 17th centuries, the Spanish crown declared sovereign default, national bankruptcy, 9 separate times. 9 times, the richest empire on earth told its creditors that it had nothing left. It is a story that defies simple logic. How do you starve while sitting at a banquet? How do you go bankrupt when your income is literally digging money out of the ground? The answer lies in a fundamental misunderstanding of what wealth actually is, a misunderstanding that turned Spain's golden blessing into a curse that hollowed out its economy, destroyed its middle class, and condemned it to a slow, agonizing decline, while nations with far fewer resources rose to take its place. This is the story of how Spain became the first victim of the resource curse, choking on its own treasure. To understand the scale of the disaster, we have to understand the scale of the windfall. When Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Americas, Spain was a relatively poor, agrarian collection of kingdoms, recently united by marriage and the end of the Reconquista. It had wool, some iron, and fierce soldiers, but little else. Then, almost overnight, Cortés conquered the Aztecs in Mexico, and Pizarro conquered the Incas in Peru. Suddenly, Spain was in possession of ancient civilizations that had been accumulating precious metals for centuries. The initial loot was immense, but it was nothing compared to what they found next. In 1545, a native Peruvian named Diego Gualpa discovered silver ore on a mountain peak in the Andes. This was Potosí, the rich hill. It turned out to be the largest silver deposit ever found. The Spanish crown immediately organized an industrial-scale extraction operation. They used a brutal system of forced native labor called the mita to drag the silver from the earth. The output was astronomical. For the next century, rivers of silver flowed from Potosí to the Pacific coast, up to Panama, across the isthmus on mules, and on to the great treasure galleons bound for Seville. This influx of metal changed everything. Before this, Europe was starved for cash. Gold and silver were rare. Economic growth was strangled because there simply wasn't enough physical money to facilitate trade. Spain turned that famine into a feast. But here is where the fatal mistake occurred. In the 16th century, the prevailing economic theory was mercantilism. This theory held that wealth consisted of the amount of precious metals a nation possessed. If you had the gold, you were rich. The Spanish monarchs, first Charles V and then his son Philip II, believed this implicitly. They looked at their silver mines and believed they were infinitely wealthy. They did not understand that gold and silver are not wealth in themselves. They are just markers of value. True wealth is the capacity of a nation to produce goods and services, to grow food, weave cloth, build ships, and innovate tools. A pile of gold on a desert island is useless. It only becomes valuable if someone else has something you want to buy with it. Spain had the gold, but it didn't have the things to buy. The country's domestic economy was still medieval, its agriculture was inefficient, and its manufacturing base was small. Suddenly, this undeveloped economy was flooded with an ocean of cash. The result was the first large-scale example in history of what economists now call the resource curse, or Dutch disease. Resource. It works like this. Imagine a small town where suddenly everyone wins the lottery on the same day. Everyone is rich in cash. They all rush out to buy new houses, new clothes, and fine food. But the town only has 2 carpenters, 1 tailor, and 3 farmers. Suddenly, you have thousands of people bidding for the limited services of those few producers. What happens? Prices skyrocket. The carpenter can now charge 10 times his normal rate because everyone can afford to pay it. This is exactly what happened to Spain on a continental scale. It was called the Price Revolution. As the treasure fleets arrived, the amount of money circulating in Spain exploded, but the amount of stuff to buy remained the same. The price of everything in Spain began to rise uncontrollably: food, rent, clothing, weapons. Throughout the 16th century, prices in Spain rose by roughly 400%. This might not sound like much compared to modern hyperinflation, but in a pre-industrial world where prices had been stable for centuries, it was catastrophic. This inflation had a secondary, more insidious effect that strangled the Spanish economy. Because prices in Spain were rising so fast, Spanish goods became incredibly expensive compared to goods made in the rest of Europe. A bolt of wool cloth made in Segovia might cost 3 times as much as a similar bolt of cloth made in England or the Netherlands. So, what did Spaniards do? They used their American silver to buy the cheaper foreign goods. Spain became a nation of consumers, importing everything from French tapestries and Italian armor to English textiles and Dutch grain. The silver from Potosí didn't stay in Spain. It flowed right through it, like water through a sieve, ending up in the pockets of merchants in London, Amsterdam, and Paris. Spain was essentially exporting its inflation to the rest of Europe, while simultaneously destroying its own domestic industries. Why would anyone invest in building a factory in Spain when it was cheaper to just import the finished product? The Spanish middle class, the artisans, merchants, and manufacturers, who are the backbone of any healthy economy, was crushed. They couldn't compete with foreign imports, and their savings were wiped out by rising prices. The country became hollowed out. A very rich aristocracy at the top, living off imported luxury, a massive impoverished peasantry at the bottom, and almost nothing in between. If this economic mismanagement wasn't bad enough, the Spanish crown decided to spend this ephemeral wealth on the most expensive activity known to man: war on a global scale. The Spanish Habsburgs saw themselves not just as kings of a country, but as the armed wing of the Catholic Church and the masters of Europe. Charles III, who ruled in the first half of the 16th century, was not only King of Spain, but also Holy Roman Emperor. This meant he was responsible for defending almost all of Central Europe. He spent his entire 40-year reign in the saddle, fighting an endless, multi-front war. He fought the French in Italy for dynastic supremacy. He fought the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe to stop the spread of Islam. And most ruinously, he fought the Protestant Reformation princes in Germany. War in the 16th century was undergoing a revolution. It was becoming incredibly expensive. Gone were the days of feudal levies where knights showed up for 40 days of unpaid service. This was the era of gunpowder, massive trace Italian fortresses, and huge standing mercenary armies. The Spanish infantry squares, the famous tercios, were the best soldiers in the world, but they expected to be paid in gold regularly. Cannon foundries, naval shipyards, and global logistics networks cost fortunes that would make a modern Pentagon accountant weep. Charles V burned through the American treasure as fast as it arrived, and it was never enough. To finance his wars, he turned to deficit spending on a monumental scale. He began borrowing heavily from German and Genoese bankers, the Fuggers, the Welsers, the Grimaldis. These bankers were happy to lend to the emperor because he had the best collateral in the world, the silver mines of the Americas. Charles V began signing contracts called asientos. These were short-term high-interest loans repaid by future deliveries of treasure. He was essentially mortgaging the future of his empire to pay for the wars of the present. By the time Charles V abdicated in 1556, exhausted and broken by his failure to stop Lutheranism, he left his son, Philip II, a poisoned chalice. Philip inherited the greatest empire on earth, but he also inherited a debt of some 20 million ducats, and every single ducat of revenue the crown was expected to earn for the next several years was already pledged to pay off bankers. Philip II was a micromanager who worked 14 hours a day in his office trying to keep the colossus afloat. He was deeply religious and viewed it as his sacred duty to stomp out Protestant heresy wherever it lived. This zeal led him into 2 disastrous conflicts that would drain the Spanish treasury dry. The first was the Dutch Revolt. The Protestant Netherlands, the industrial and commercial heart of his European possessions, rebelled against Spanish rule and religious persecution. Philip sent his best generals and the dreaded army of Flanders to crush the rebellion. It turned into an 80-year war of attrition, a financial black hole that consumed enormous amounts of men and money year after year with no end in sight. The second was his war against Protestant England under Queen Elizabeth I, culminating in the famous Spanish Armada of 1588. The Armada was one of the most expensive military undertakings in history up to that point, a massive fleet designed to invade England. It ended in total disaster, shipwrecked by English fire ships and North Sea storms. The investment was unrecoverable. The costs of these global commitments were simply unsustainable, no matter how much silver came out of Potosí. The crown's finances operated on a knife edge. They were always waiting for the next treasure fleet to arrive to pay the troops fighting in Flanders or the sailors in the Mediterranean. If a fleet was delayed by a hurricane, or worse, captured by Dutch or English privateers, like Piet Heine's famous capture of the entire treasure fleet in 1628, the whole house of cards collapsed. When the money didn't arrive, the soldiers didn't get paid. When the soldiers didn't get paid, they mutinied. The Spanish army of Flanders mutinied dozens of times, often turning their weapons on the very cities they were supposed to be protecting, sacking them to get their back pay. The Spanish Fury at Antwerp in 1576, where unpaid Spanish troops burned the city to the ground, was a direct result of the crown's financial insolvency. The clash between runaway spending and the reality of debt led to the inevitable, the bankruptcies. The term bankruptcy is slightly misleading when applied to a sovereign state in this era. The king didn't lose his throne, the country didn't close down. Instead, it was a suspension of payments. The king would issue a royal decree stating that the crown could not meet its obligations to its creditors. He would stop paying interest on the asientos. The first great shock came in 1557, right at the start of Philip II's reign. Despite the massive revenues, the debt servicing costs had become enormous. Philip simply stopped paying the German bankers. This sent a shockwave through the financial capitals of Europe. The great banking house of the Fuggers in Augsburg was nearly ruined. But the King of Spain was too big to fail. The bankers had no choice but to negotiate. Usually, these bankruptcies ended with the short-term, high-interest debt being forcibly converted into long-term, low-interest government bonds called juros. The bankers lost a fortune in expected profits, but they got a steady, if smaller, income stream, and the king got breathing room to start borrowing again. It became a cyclical addiction. The crown would borrow massively to fund a war, the debt would become unsustainable, they would declare bankruptcy to clear the books, and then, because they still owned the silver mines, new bankers, often Genoese who replaced the Germans after 1557, would step in to lend again, hoping this time it would be different. It never was. Philip II defaulted again in 1575, a massive cancellation of debt that directly led to the sack of Antwerp, because his credit was so frozen he couldn't send money to his troops. He defaulted a third time in 1596, towards the end of his life, his treasury emptied by the Armada disaster and intervention in the French Wars of Religion. When Philip II died in 1598, he had received perhaps more gold and silver than any monarch in history, yet he left his kingdom poorer and more indebted than he found it. The 17th century saw the slow, agonizing death spiral. The kings that followed, Philip III, Philip IV, and the tragically inbred Charles II, were lesser men dealing with greater problems. The influx of silver from the Americas began to slow down as the easiest veins were tapped out and the native population working the mines died off from disease and brutal overwork. Yet the crown's spending did not decrease. The wars continued, especially the endless meat grinder of the 30 Years' War in Germany, which Spain felt obligated to join in support of their Austrian Habsburg cousins. As silver revenues declined and expenses mounted, the bankruptcies came faster and hit harder. There were defaults in 1607, 1627, 1647, 1652, and 1662. Each one was a testament to a failed system. By the mid-17th century, the Spanish financial system was a shambles. The crown was so desperate for cash that it began debasing its own domestic currency. They minted coins made almost entirely of copper, called vellon, and forced the Spanish people to use them at face value, while hoarding the real silver for foreign creditors and wars. This triggered hyperinflation domestically, causing bread riots and further destroying the internal economy. The great Genoese banking families, who had grown fabulously wealthy financing Spanish debt for a century, were eventually dragged down too. The 1627 bankruptcy was particularly devastating to them, signaling the end of Genoa's period of financial dominance. Spain was toxic. No one wanted to lend to them anymore. By the time Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, died in 1700, the empire was a rotting carcass. The army that had once terrified Europe was reduced to a shadow force, often unpaid and ill-equipped. The great treasure fleets were few and far between. The domestic economy was non-existent. Spain, the country that had owned the money, ended the era as one of the poorest, most backward nations in Western Europe. The ultimate tragedy of the Spanish Empire was that its gold was its undoing. It acted as a narcotic. Because they could always just dig up more money, they never felt the pressure to reform their economy, to innovate, or to build a sustainable tax base. They didn't need to build industries because they could buy them. They didn't need to reform their feudal agricultural system because they could import grain. The easy wealth allowed them to ignore reality for 150 years. Meanwhile, nations that were starved of gold, like England and the Netherlands, were forced to be creative. They couldn't just buy what they needed, they had to make it. They developed sophisticated banking systems, stock markets, efficient agricultural practices, and powerful merchant marines. They built economies based on production, not extraction. When the silver ran out for Spain, they had nothing left but debt and glory. But the nations that had supplied Spain, the ones who ended up with the silver in the end, had built the foundations of the modern industrial world. Spain's 9 bankruptcies remain a stark historical warning. Money is not wealth, and an abundance of resources without an economy to manage them is not a blessing, but a path to ruin. Spain SS rise and fall is the ultimate warning. Easy money is often the most dangerous kind. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the trap of gold, please hit the like button. It truly helps the channel grow and reach new history fans. And I want to hear your opinion. Do you think any modern countries are making the same mistakes Spain did today? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. I'm your name. This is Econ Empires, and thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow for another financial mystery.